was for all mankind, and that for all our ills and all the things in our fallen nature, it was a redemption.
In 363 AD, a group of bishops gathered in a city called Laodicea. They were not armies. They carried no swords. They held no military power. What they held was something far more consequential: the authority to decide what the Christian world would be permitted to read, permitted to believe, and permitted to know about the man at the center of their faith. They reviewed a list. It was a list of texts that had circulated freely among the earliest Christians for nearly 3 centuries. Texts that had been quoted by the Church's own founding fathers. Texts that had been copied, shared, and treated as sacred by the very communities that first walked away from the empty tomb. Those men in that room looked at those texts and made a decision. They banned them. Copies were collected. Manuscripts were burned. And the portrait of Jesus contained inside those pages, a portrait the earliest believers had accepted without question, was systematically removed from Western Christianity's memory, almost completely. Because in one place, in a mountainous region of northeastern Africa that Rome could not reach, and later centuries would not disturb, a group of monks never received the order. They had no idea that the texts they were copying had been declared forbidden. They had no idea that the Jesus they were preserving, the blazing, cosmic, fire-eyed figure of their ancient scriptures, was being replaced elsewhere with something far gentler, far more manageable, far more useful to institutional power. They just kept copying. Generation after generation, through war and famine and isolation, in stone monasteries clinging to cliffsides in the Ethiopian highlands, they preserved what the rest of the world was told did not exist. And now, 17 centuries after the burning, a Hollywood director who once bet his career and his personal fortune on telling the unfiltered story of the crucifixion has spent a decade quietly building a film around what those monks preserved. He has described his vision in fragments across interviews and podcasts. When the descriptions are assembled and placed beside the Ethiopian texts, the alignment is precise enough to be unsettling. The question is not whether Mel Gibson found the Ethiopian Bible. The question is what it means that both arrived at the same figure. A figure that once filled the room at Laodicea with enough theological alarm that powerful men decided the world should never see it. The Council of Laodicea convened approximately 363 AD. Among its documented outputs was a canonical list restricting which texts were approved for public reading in Christian worship. This is a matter of historical record, not conspiracy. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest continuously practicing Christian institutions on earth. Christianity arrived in the Ethiopian kingdom of Aksum during the 4th century under King Ezana, not as a colonial transplant centuries later, but as an early and organic extension of the faith that had spread south and east from Jerusalem in its first generation. The Ethiopian Orthodox canon contains up to 88 books, significantly more than the 66-book Protestant canon and the 73-book Catholic canon. Among the books included and continuously read within Ethiopian Christianity are the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Ascension of Isaiah, all 3 of which were excluded from the Western canonical tradition. The Book of Enoch is not a recently discovered fringe document. Fragments of it were among the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran in 1947, confirming it circulated widely in devout Jewish communities during the centuries that produced early Christianity. Early church fathers, including Tertullian and Irenaeus, quoted from it as authoritative text. The New Testament's own Epistle of Jude cites it by name and treats its prophecy as legitimate. Historians of early Christianity broadly agree that the canonical formation process of the 3rd and 4th centuries involved genuine theological deliberation, not a simple act of suppression. The reasons particular texts were excluded are debated across multiple academic traditions. Some scholars argue purely doctrinal concerns drove the decisions. Others, including scholars working in post-colonial frameworks, argue that institutional and political factors, including the consolidation of clerical authority, influenced which voices survived. The degree to which the Ethiopian Church's canon represents a preserved original versus a parallel development remains actively researched. Work coming out of the study of Aksumite manuscript traditions has, in recent years, begun attracting serious academic attention. The proposition that the exclusion of Enochic and related texts was a deliberate act of institutional self-preservation, specifically that the message of direct, unmediated access to the divine threatened centralized clerical authority, is a theory with scholarly advocates. It is not, however, a proven historical conclusion. It should be understood as a serious interpretive argument, not a confirmed fact. Here is what creates the rupture. Every tradition within early Christianity appears to have operated from a shared understanding of who Christ was. The descriptions in the Book of Enoch, a figure of white hair and blazing presence sitting at the center of a cosmic courtroom, commanding obedience from angelic beings across every realm of existence, and the description of Christ in the Book of Revelation, chapter 1. Hair white as wool, eyes like fire, feet like polished bronze, voice like rushing water, face blazing with light too intense to look at directly, are not similar. Scholars of ancient Jewish and Christian literature have confirmed they appear to draw from the same source tradition. Yet Revelation survived every canonical council. Enoch did not. The anomaly is not that a decision was made to exclude certain texts. Decisions of that kind were part of how canons were formed, and they happened across multiple traditions, not just the Western one. The anomaly is what was lost in the exclusion. The image of Christ carried by the earliest communities, cosmically terrifying, dimensionally vast, present across every level of reality, was the standard portrait until it wasn't. The transition from that figure to the gentle, softly lit shepherd of Western Renaissance painting did not happen in a single moment, but it happened thoroughly, and it happened in one direction. The monks in Ethiopia never got the memo. Their portrait never changed. For 15 centuries, Ethiopian Christians read the blazing figure of Enoch as simply the correct and obvious truth about who Jesus was. They had no category for any other version, because no other version ever reached their monasteries. When Western scholars first began examining the full Ethiopian canon in modern times, the degree of divergence required an explanation. Not of the texts themselves, which are internally coherent, but of the gap, the 17th century gap, between what Eastern Africa preserved and what the Western world was given. The conversation shifted in November 2016, when Mel Gibson appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience. He had spent 12 years since The Passion of the Christ working on a sequel. He had, by that point, developed two distinct versions of the script. He described the first as relatively conventional, a structured resurrection narrative that audiences would recognize. He described the second in terms that caught the attention of anyone who had read the Ethiopian texts. He called it an acid trip. He described a film that would begin before Bethlehem, that would open with the fall of the angels, that would move the audience through multiple realms of reality operating on entirely different rules than human time and space. That would treat the resurrection not as a single linear event, but as something that occurred simultaneously across dimensions of existence. Those are not the words of a filmmaker being theatrical. Those are not metaphors for artistic ambition. Word for word, they describe the cosmological framework of the Ascension of Isaiah, a text composed in the late 1st or early 2nd century, preserved in its complete form only within the Ethiopian canon, and describing the architecture of creation as exactly the 7-layered cosmos Gibson appears to be constructing. In 2024, the resurrection of the Christ moved from development to production. It is currently filming at Cinecittà Studios in Rome. The budget is reported at $100 million. Lionsgate is attached for distribution. The release is structured as 2 parts. Part 1 on Good Friday 2027, Part 2 on Ascension Day. Exactly 40 days later. The calendar is itself a theological architecture. The scripts are classified. At the American film market, international buyers of significant stature were reportedly asked to commit to distribution deals without access to the material. In an industry built on screeners and pitch decks, Gibson asked for trust based on name alone. Most of the room said yes. Here is where the stakes become difficult to ignore. The Ascension of Isaiah does not simply describe 7 heavens. It describes the mechanics of the incarnation in a way that no Western canonical text attempts. As Christ descends through each level of creation on his way to earth, he deliberately veils himself. At every heaven he dims his own radiance, so that the beings at that level perceive him as one of their own, an angel among angels, a celestial among celestials, not because he is diminished, not because he is in hiding, but because if he arrived at each level at his true and full magnitude, the existence at that level could not survive the encounter. He passes through heaven after heaven unrecognized. He arrives in Bethlehem as a human infant. Every realm of creation witnessed the incarnation. Almost none of them understood what they were looking at. Now place that beside Gibson's documented description. The resurrection cannot follow a linear timeline because it is happening simultaneously across multiple realms of reality. The overlap is not approximate, it is structural. Expert opinion within biblical scholarship is divided on how to handle this alignment. Some scholars working in the history of early Christian literature note that figures like Gibson, with deep personal investment in scriptural immersion over decades, sometimes arrive at the same interpretive frameworks as ancient texts through what might be called theological intuition, rather than direct textual encounter. Others are more cautious, noting that Gibson's production team is not publicly commenting on their sources, and the scripts remain inaccessible. What cannot be disputed is the institutional response, or rather, the institutional silence. The academic study of Ethiopian manuscript traditions remains significantly underfunded relative to Western and Eastern Mediterranean textual studies. The manuscripts that have never been translated. The oral traditions passed alongside the written copies. The scholarly infrastructure to examine them systematically is only beginning to be assembled. It is worth noting, carefully and without overstatement, that the people with the most to gain from Western Christianity, retaining its current portrait of Christ, have not historically been eager to fund the excavation of what Ethiopia preserved. That is not a conspiracy. That is the ordinary momentum of institutional self-interest. The canonical councils of the 3rd and 4th centuries made defensible theological decisions based on criteria of apostolic authorship, liturgical use, and doctrinal consistency. The texts that were excluded, including the Enochic tradition, were excluded for legitimate reasons that scholars have documented and debated across more than a century of academic work. The Ethiopian canon's preservation of additional texts reflects the particular theological development of an isolated church, not a suppression of original truth. The cosmic Christ of Ethiopian tradition and the gentle shepherd of Western tradition are both incomplete representations of a complex theological inheritance, and neither is more original than the other in any straightforwardly recoverable sense. The exclusion of texts emphasizing direct, unmediated access to the divine, the kingdom of God is within you tradition, is not coincidental to the consolidation of clerical authority in the same period. The institutional church that emerged from the 4th century councils was financially dependent on its role as intermediary between human beings and God. Texts that rendered that intermediary role unnecessary were, by institutional logic, threatening. The survival of those texts in Ethiopia, an area geographically and politically beyond Rome's reach, constitutes an accidental preservation of an older tradition. Gibson's film may be the first mass-market delivery mechanism for that tradition in 17 centuries. Gibson is a filmmaker, not a theologian. His public statements about the film's structure may reflect artistic ambition more than textual fidelity. The alignment between his descriptions and the Ethiopian texts may be coincidental, or may reflect the common source pool of mystical imagery available to anyone immersed in Christian scripture across multiple traditions. The film has not been released. Its scripts are classified. Any analysis of what it contains or intends is, at this point, speculation built on statements from press appearances. The genuine importance of the Ethiopian textual tradition deserves academic examination on its own terms, independent of a Hollywood production calendar. All three positions contain serious arguments. The audience is entitled to hold all three simultaneously. Step back from the film and the scholarship and the canonical politics for a moment. Consider the monks. They had no knowledge of the councils that had ruled against their manuscripts. They had no awareness of the book burnings in Rome and Constantinople. They were not engaged in a protest. They were not preserving a secret. They climbed their mountains, sat in their stone rooms, dipped their pens, and copied what they believed every word of the text they held was sacred. They did this for 1,500 years. Through war, through famine, through centuries of isolation from every other branch of the faith they shared. They asked nothing in return. They expected nothing from the outside world. They had no plan for their manuscripts to eventually reach a Hollywood director working in 2020's Rome. They just kept going. That commitment, 17 centuries of anonymous, unrewarded faithfulness to a text, is, independent of any theological question, one of the more remarkable acts of intellectual and spiritual preservation in human history. And what they preserved raises a question that goes beyond Mel Gibson, beyond scholarly debates about canon formation, beyond the commercial fate of a two-part blockbuster releasing on a theologically engineered calendar. If the portrait of Jesus carried by 1 billion people right now was shaped primarily by what survived the purge of 363 AD, and then reshaped again by European artists illustrating those surviving texts 1,000 years after the originals had already been destroyed, then what exactly is that portrait a portrait of? Not of the original texts, not of what the communities closest to the events actually read and believed, of a filtered, edited, institutionally curated version of a figure who, if the Ethiopian tradition is anywhere close to accurate, was something so cosmically vast and immediately present and institutionally uncontrollable that powerful men concluded ordinary people were better off not meeting him. That is not a small question. It is, in fact, one of the largest questions available to human beings. The monks in the Tigray highlands are still there. The monasteries on the cliffsides that held the manuscripts through every century are still standing. The texts are still being copied in some of them, not because anyone assigned the task, but because the tradition never stopped. And scholars working in early Christian history are only now beginning to approach the full scale of what those mountains contain. There are manuscripts in the Tigray region that have never been translated into any modern language, complete texts that Western scholarship has not yet examined. Oral traditions passed alongside the written record for generations, theological understanding that exists nowhere in Western academic literature. The Book of Enoch alone, one voice, one text, one fragment of what Ethiopia preserved, is enough to destabilize 17 centuries of assumption about who Jesus was and what his resurrection actually meant. What is sitting in the manuscripts that haven't been opened yet? In 2027, for the first time in history, something close to the cosmic Christ of Enoch and Isaiah and the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition will appear on the largest screens available to human beings. In IMAX theaters, in multiplexes, in every major city on Earth. $100 million spent to render what 15 centuries of monks, preserved in stone rooms with lamplight and reed pens. Whether Gibson's film is a masterpiece or a disappointment, whether it is faithful to the texts or a filmmaker's interpretation, whether it changes the cultural portrait of Jesus or disappears into the noise, that is not ultimately the most important thing here. The most important thing is the question the Ethiopian tradition has been quietly sitting with for 17 centuries, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to. Not, who was Jesus to the Western Church? But, who was Jesus before the Western Church decided what you were allowed to know? The monks kept the answer. The question now is whether the world is ready to read it.